Welcome to Praxis, a podcast where we explore how to practice and embody the way of Jesus in our everyday lives. Thanks so much for taking the time to listen. Today, we're going to talk about another one of our core values as a church, which is generosity. So we want to be a generous church that reflects a generous God. And building on our value of participation, we believe that every disciple of Jesus is called into living a generous life. Now, we know that talking about generosity and giving can be an uncomfortable topic. So in this episode, we discuss why that is, and then we introduce some generosity axioms and some paradigm shifts around the topic of generosity, and then name some specific ways people can move towards living a more generous life. So that's where we're headed. Here is our next episode of Praxis on generosity.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Katie.
And I'm Cameron.
And I'm Mac.
So, here we are. It's a beautiful, snowy Thursday morning. How are you guys doing?
It's beautiful. Not too cold outside. It's nice.
Yeah, it is nice. I'll be honest. I'm, at this moment, feeling envious. It's been about a month since I've shaved, and it's not going great. And I'm looking over at you, Cameron, and going, wow. Like, that facial foliage is impressive.
Well, thanks.
I have some beard envy.
How long has it been since you've shaved, Cameron?
Let's see. With a razor, I don't think I've shaved with a razor since I've been here. So it's been at least 6 or 7 years, maybe 8 years.
Now,
maybe I did it once.
I have a question, and I have an answer that I'm assuming an answer, but do you do anything to care for your beard on a regular basis?
I do use shampoo. So I do have some beard oil, but I don't use it as often as I probably should.
So it's all natural.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
So the last time I trimmed it, I was probably I left it kind of long. So it doesn't necessarily grow super fast. I just don't ever shave it off.
Well, nevertheless, it is impressive.
Well, thanks.
Yep.
So our listeners might not know this, but sitting at the table with us is Adam Johnson, who is our production master.
Yeah. Hey, everyone.
And I recently learned that Adam used to have a beard longer than Cameron's.
Adam can grow a stellar man mane. I mean, it is so impressive.
Yeah. I don't keep it around very much. It seems to everyone else's dismay, but
What did you think when you saw the Slack channel open up
I
about bringing back Adam's beard?
it didn't make me want to do it, but
Really? Did it make you want to do it less?
I kind of dig my heels in.
The peer pressure was counterproductive.
Right.
Well, maybe as our listeners join the bandwagon, the peer pressure will mount. And
Sure. Yeah.
you'll cave.
Leave a comment if you want the beard back. Not that it'll change anything, but
Hey, so we're in a series right now where we're talking about our core values as a church. Brene Brown, an author that I really enjoy, says we can't live into values that we can't name. So that's what we're doing in this series. We're naming our values as a church so that we can live into them. In our last episode, we talked about the value of participation. And if you haven't listened to that one, we encourage you to check it out. Today, we want to name a fourth core value, and that's generosity. We want to be a generous church that reflects a generous God. And building on this value of participation, we believe that every disciple of Jesus is to grow and live into living a generous life.
Now, we want to start by acknowledging that this topic can be uncomfortable. There can be some discomfort around it. I think there's a few reasons for this. One is that for some reason in our culture, money is kind of like a taboo topic. Like, it's inappropriate to ask someone how much they make. Why do you guys think that is? I have no idea. As I was thinking about this, that's really weird. Like, there's all sorts of other things we talk about, but one of them is just we don't talk about how much people make and how much their houses are. All those. There's just some taboo, some social taboo around that.
Yeah, I wonder if it implies judgment. I feel like if you ask me how much I make, then all of a sudden you may be judging what I spend it on.
That could be.
Yeah, and there's probably some value and worth tied into it because we sort of attach worth to people based on how much they make. There could be immediately a comparison judgment, as well as then opening up kind of the what you're spending your resources on. I feel like also opens up some layers of judgment. What about you, Cameron?
Yeah, no, I think those both make sense. I couldn't think of anything, so I think both those totally make sense. So I think there's like some taboo just already around it, talking about how you spend your money. I think there's some bad experiences people have in the church around giving, with people using lots of guilt and shame and pressure tactics, or like bad stewardship, like maybe seeing what churches you've been a part of in the past have spent money on. You think, well, I don't know, like you're going to get me to be generous and sacrifice, and you're going to spend money on that.
The new fog machine.
Right, exactly. I think that another reason why this is kind of uncomfortable to talk about is, I mean, if we're honest right now, it's January of 2023, and there's all this talk of recession, and egg prices are through the roof, and gas prices are through the roof. 65% of Americans said they don't know how much they spent last month. 50% of people are living paycheck to paycheck, some surveys say. And there's all sorts of other things you're supposed to be spending your money on, like saving for retirement if you're a good person, saving for your kids' college if you're a good person, house payments, carpet, like all these things.
Yep.
There's just a lot. And so to then kind of have another thing on top of that you need to give money to, I think can just feel uncomfortable.
Yeah, I think what you're summarizing is that there may be a lot of fear attached to like insecurity around, will I have enough? There's a question mark for a lot of people as we're living in maybe a lot of economic uncertainty, rising prices, like where does this end? And will I have enough?
Yeah.
Yeah, and if we think about the church in particular, I think probably layered on top of that, it's probably fairly common to assume that, hey, this church looks like it's got everything it needs, and I assume other people are giving, maybe people that make more than I do, so maybe I don't need to.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think maybe another reason why this topic can make people feel uncomfortable is that it can be a source of conviction. In other words, talking about our resources can shine a light on places maybe we'd rather not address.
Yeah.
Do you like eggs, Katie?
I do. I eat poached eggs every morning.
What about you, Cameron?
Yeah.
Yeah, so this has been a tough year egg-wise.
They weren't too bad at Costco.
I was going to say Costco's the spot to go for eggs.
I know. We got a Costco membership for the first time this past year, and Josie came back with like 5 dozen eggs or something this week. We go once a month, and so yeah, Costco is the place to go.
Does that mean that you're going to take back all that Costco hating that you did before you had a membership?
I don't remember my Costco hating. I think it might have been kind of around some jokes around cancel culture.
I think it was more just skepticism that people who think they save money actually spend more, which could very well be true.
I still have that skepticism. Okay. Josie and I have some pretty, she's very disciplined when she goes and does not overspend.
That doesn't surprise me.
So,
I am not.
Yes, I think when it comes to Costco, there's a lot of people who think they're saving money, but in fact, they're just spending a whole lot more.
Touche.
Yeah. Well, hey, can I name it? I don't think it's just other people that maybe feel uncomfortable talking about finances or generosity. I'd want to name my own discomfort around this topic. I think many pastors, including myself, often feel uncomfortable talking about financial resources in the church. And I think because of this, a whole lot of pastors just don't talk about it. It's easier not to talk about it. And that's probably where I was up until a few years ago, to be honest. And a handful of things changed that for me. One was I had someone call me on the carpet. So this was a mentor of mine outside of our church who basically challenged me to grow in all things financial. And he said, Mac, the church needs pastors who know how to talk about generosity and financial stewardship in healthy ways. And I felt like I took that challenge to heart. And as I began looking at things, secondly, I noticed how Jesus did this. Like Jesus didn't shy away from talking about money and resources. In fact, I once heard a statistic that it was the 3rd most frequent topic that Jesus discussed in all of his teachings. So Jesus didn't back down. he talked about this quite frequently, and I noticed, okay, well, then there's a gap between me and Jesus, the way Jesus led and the way I'm leading, that I need to shore up. And then there was this growing conviction that part of the reason why Jesus talked about this is because this is a mark of discipleship. Like a primary characteristic of a growing disciple is that they learn how to live a generous life. And then I think lastly, I just started to notice that this is an area that Christians really need to grow in. So some statistics. The average giving by adults who attend Protestant churches is about $17 a week. 37% of people who attend an evangelical church do not give anything to their church. Christians are currently giving away about 2.5% of their income. During the Great Depression, it was 3.3%. In other words, Christians during the Great Depression were giving away more than Christians today. And I think part of that is because there's this assumption that the more we make, the more generous we'll be. But actually, every data point contradicts that. That the more you make, actually, the more you spend on yourself. Only 1% of those who make more than $75,000 a year give away 10% of their income. So I'm just naming that I think that this is actually an area that, as followers of Jesus, we need to grow into. We'll talk more about this in a bit. We don't believe that giving is a specific dollar amount or percentage that we're all sort of locked into. It's rather a lifestyle, an entire lifestyle lived in response to the gospel. But it's clear to me, at least, that this is an area we shouldn't ignore. It's sort of wrapped up with discipleship, and it's an area we need to grow in. And at the same time, we don't want to use pressure tactics or fear or manipulation, all those negative things, Cameron, you sort of alluded to. We want to avoid those at the same time. Mm-hmm. And so that's sort of the tension I feel like I'm sitting in. I'm curious, do you guys notice or feel that tension too?
Yeah, absolutely, I do. I think what you're saying is that because we maybe have talked about money poorly inside the church and outside the church, and there is all this discomfort around it, we've maybe overcompensated.
Yeah, and at least my default initially would be, because of that, not wanting to add to it, I'd rather avoid it.
Yeah, we don't want to make people feel uncomfortable.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and culturally, I think there's a lot of forces that are pressuring us to use our resources on ourselves. I mean, even just having like a cell phone means you're getting advertised to at all hours of the day. There's pressure to use your extra time to like start a business or a side hustle and make more money. There's, there's pressure to use your stuff for things that are going to benefit you or make you feel better. And generosity is about sacrificing, which is very countercultural.
Almost the exact opposite. Mm-hmm. Like we're in a culture that is continually sort of inviting us to act out of our own self-interest and further ourselves. And a generous lifestyle is actually the opposite. It's like this, instead of a self-centered, it's an others-oriented disposition that I bring to all of life.
Mm-hmm. So that makes me think of a story. I'm debating in my head whether or not to share this because I don't want to sound... Well, I'll just share it. Have you guys heard the term mompreneurs?
Yeah. I heard it for the first time this week from you.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So the idea of like a mompreneur is generally a stay-at-home mom or maybe a working mom, but who wants a side hustle, basically. And it's usually where you like sell product and you try to get other people to come under you who then also sell product, and then the money sort of flows. It's a multi-level marketing scheme, I believe is what they call it. Anyways, I had someone approach me one time who wanted me to join her mompreneur business. And she led with the question, what would you do if you had an extra $100 a month? Just kind of what you were saying, Cameron. And my response, just without thinking much, was like, well, I don't know. I'd probably give it away. And that just sort of stopped her. Like she didn't know what to do with that. Because I think that was, again, like that's sort of a tactic to get us to always want more, to be able to do more and buy more and consume more. It's built on this idea that more is always better and you should always be trying to get more things. I don't know.
That's interesting. So like the enticement, the sales pitch included, you could have $100 more. Think about how that could enhance your life. And you just respond, I'd probably give it away. And like, whoa, sales pitch ends, because that's not how people are supposed to respond.
Yeah, and I wasn't trying to be clever, but I just sort of noticed this awkward look on her face, and then she didn't know where to go with it.
Yeah. Well, here's where we're at. We as a church are very committed to avoiding some of the negative experiences people would have around financial conversation, the way that money is often approached in unhealthy ways. So I kind of alluded to sometimes there's these pressure tactics, manipulation or guilt, sort of trying to get people to give. And we are committed to not like pivoting out of any of those things. And so honestly, if someone's at our church and like you don't want to give, we're not going to force you to give. Like that's up to you. But we are committed to talking about generosity and financial giving, hopefully in some healthy ways. And we've developed what we call generosity axioms. We probably got about 10 or 15 of them that sort of kind of in short, concise ways capture some of our convictions around generosity in hopefully some healthy ways. And we wanted to share some of those with our listeners today. So who wants to kick us off?
Yeah, I will. The first one I had down was God doesn't need generosity from us. God wants generosity for us. So this idea is that God doesn't need our money or our resources to accomplish, his mission here on earth. We kind of touched on this in the participation episode, but basically God's mission to redeem and restore and renew all things doesn't depend on my $50. Like, I'm not that important. But rather, God wants to grow us as generous people, and that it's essential to becoming a disciple of Christ. So we look at how Jesus gave us a perfect example of generosity by his life, and then he calls his followers to do the same. So it's, baked into this is the idea is that learning to give is actually good for us. There's studies we've talked about from the stage on how it rewires our brain and makes us happier people. So I think there's a psychology behind this.
There is. In fact, there was a study done with monkeys and juice boxes. I think it was at Yale. And one group of monkeys had their juice boxes, and they refused to share it with the other monkeys who didn't have juice boxes. And so they basically acted selfishly. And as they studied the neuroactivity in their brains, it basically shut down. Conversely, there were monkeys who shared their juice boxes with other monkeys who didn't have them, and the neuroactivity in their brain basically lit up like a Christmas tree. And this same study has been repeated with human beings and so on, and same thing. It shows that when we live in a generous way, when we give ourselves away to other people, sharing our resources, it actually increases our relational connection and leads to greater happiness and joy in our lives. And I think that's really important because I think when some people hear an invitation to give, it very much feels like you're trying to take something away rather than a step towards greater joy, greater happiness, greater excitement, greater relational connectivity, and so on.
Yeah, that's really cool. So it's almost like the science is sort of catching up to what God said all along.
Yes.
Giving. So giving does make us happier people. And at the same time, I don't think it's just about becoming happier people, right? It's about ultimately being transformed into the image of Christ. So that's this idea that as we put into practice Jesus' teachings on generosity, God changes our hearts. He's sort of, I see it as softening our grip on material things, our grip, and teaching us to rely on him to provide that daily bread and what we need, and rather than sort of grasping and hoarding to get our needs met. So God wants generosity for us because he wants to transform our hearts and for us to experience the joy of living a generous life.
Yeah, and there's the passage, I don't remember what reference it is, where Jesus says, where your treasure is, there your heart is also. So I think as God prompts us to be generous towards things in his kingdom and towards other people, it's a way of like getting our heart invested in those things as well.
Yeah, aligning our hearts with God's heart. Yeah, so that's our first axiom. And again, there's kind of like two parts to it. God doesn't need generosity from us, so he's not like begging us for our giving. He's a God of abundance rather than scarcity. And then God wants generosity for us. There's something in it for us as we lean in and align our hearts with God's heart and live a generous life. Here's another one that we probably repeat with the most frequency in our community, and it's this: we are blessed to be a blessing. So the basic idea is that God blesses us, but God's blessing to us shouldn't stop with us. It's to sort of overflow towards other people. So God's blessings in our lives flows through us ultimately to others. This was a few years ago. I over the summer I was given a sabbatical, and when I came home, we got out of town for the summer, and when I returned, there was a field near my house that had been transformed. They basically dug out this field and turned it into a pond, and what we noticed, the idea was like, hey, this will be a better looking space than just an open field or whatever. But the problem is like all the geese and ducks in Oconomowoc, where we live, made that their home. And they would just sit there all day and presumably poop in the water. So my boys and I dubbed this pond the poop pond, because you'd never want to swim in it. You know what I mean? That'd just be disgusting.
Gross.
The water's just sitting there. It's getting nasty.
Probably unhealthy.
Yeah, so they transformed this field into a poop pond, and that's sort of become a metaphor for what happens when God blesses us, and rather than that flowing through us to others, it just sort of sits there and sort of spoils. It's the difference between like a pond and a river. A pond has no outlet, and so there's all that green, nasty stuff on top of the water versus a river that ultimately feeds into some other place. And I think that's what happens when, this is what we see with Israel. God wanted to bless Israel so they could be a blessing to the nations, and throughout the Old Testament, there's this sort of struggle because the blessings stop with them rather than actually flowing towards others.
Yeah, so it's interesting to think about what's underneath that. There's usually a reason that the blessing is hoarded. And it, again, makes me kind of think about the things we just named, like anxiety, discomfort, wanting to make sure that our own needs are met, which are in some ways legitimate. It's not like those are illegitimate fears. We need money to survive.
We need eggs.
We need eggs.
Yeah.
I certainly do.
And gas.
Yeah, that's true. In our world, we definitely do. Another one is giving is one of the ways we join God's work in the world. If you think about it, every act in the kingdom of God, anything we're going to do that God is asking us to do requires generosity of some sort, whether that's being generous with your money, like we've been talking about a lot, but also we believe all these generosity things apply to our time and our gifts and our talents and all the other resources we might have. And to love someone requires some sort of sacrifice in order to do that.
Yeah, so giving is one of the ways we join God's work in the world. And this, I think, just opens up a whole realm of possibility for the people in our community, because it's not just, giving during an offering moment on the weekend, but as they go through their life and they encounter people maybe at work or when they're dropping their kids off at school or in their neighborhood or whatever, and they notice a need, that might be God's invitation to come alongside, accompany that person maybe through a difficult season in life, giving of their time or energy or maybe financial resources. I mean, we've got a Facebook group for our community, and it's become this place where people can share their resources or let people know of needs, and other people can step in. And I think of, man, over the last year or two, different people going, man, I encountered this single mom who is in the middle of a crisis and she needs a new car. Can we figure out how to pool our resources to make sure this person has a car? And sure enough, like, people step into that. And that, I just think that's like maybe putting stories to when we actually show up with our resources, that brings possibility to almost every interaction we have to go, this is how I can join God's work in reflecting who he is in some tangible ways.
Yeah, so two things that just stuck out to me as you were talking. The first is that generosity isn't just financial. We've been kind of focusing on financial generosity, but it's so much more than that. It's giving of time and energy and resources, and there are many, many ways we can be generous. And the second thing you mentioned is that it's almost kind of like a muscle memory in a way. Like, as we start to give, we become more comfortable with giving. We become more attuned and aware of needs that are all around us. And we start to just be more comfortable stepping into to living a lifestyle of generosity in lots of ways.
Yeah. Go ahead, Cameron.
I think it's Sheryl Crow who says the first cut is the deepest. Is that right? Usually that first sacrifice or the first time you step into something is way harder than the next time.
Yeah.
That's exactly what she was getting at too.
Katie, you mentioned, and in churches we often talk about like time, treasure, and talent to get beyond giving is just about financial. I read a book called Build a Better Life. This is probably a handful of years ago. And he talks about, he uses the word capital. So he talks about 5 different capitals that each person has: spiritual capital, relational capital, physical capital, intellectual capital, and financial capital. And he says, like, if we think about generosity being an all of life thing, we all have like some mix of those 5 capitals. And actually those are in order of priority for him. So financial is last. So yeah, I would just encourage our listeners, if you're hearing us use the word generosity or giving, sometimes we are zooming in on the financial piece, but in fact, we're at least when I use it, I'm thinking all of life, like everything that I am, everything that I have, sort of having this posture of open hands towards God. How do you want me to use this? It's available to you, right?
Yeah, I think that's important.
All right. Another one that we use with some degree of frequency here at Crosspoint is that giving isn't a percentage or dollar amount, but an entire lifestyle lived in response to the gospel. And so there's a couple things here. First is that we don't believe that generosity, financial generosity, is a percentage or a dollar amount. So I probably don't have time to go into all of this, but I don't believe that the Bible teaches that followers of Jesus need to give a strict 10% of their income. And if you want a deeper dive into this, I preached a sermon on it in November of 2021 called A Generous Church, and I kind of unpack a theology of giving. But the skinny is that, the first time a 10% tithe shows up in the Bible is with Abram in Genesis 14, and he gives 10% of some military spoils to the priest of Salem named Melchizedek. But the thing is it's a one-time thing. It's not a recurring thing. It's a one-time 10% gift to a specific person, and it's completely voluntary. It's not mandatory or obligated. The next time we encounter a 10% tithe was with Jacob after his dream where he encounters God. He determines to give 10% for the rest of his life to God. But it's completely voluntary. It's not a mandatory or obligatory thing. It's his own volition that chooses to do that. You really don't get a 10% tithe until the Mosaic covenant is put in place to support the temple and sort of Levitical priesthood. And so I would want our listeners to know that the 10% tithe is sort of wrapped up in the Mosaic covenant. And in the New Testament, the 10% tithe isn't mentioned really at all. In fact, the one time Jesus mentions it is when he's chewing out the religious leaders for neglecting the weightier matters of the law, justice, love, mercy, that type of thing, and kind of practicing their minute sort of detail practice of giving mint, dill, and cumin and things of that sort. And so that's kind of a skinny. Now, here's the thing is some people might think, oh, if I don't have to give 10%, if that's not obligated, if that's not an obligation that I have to step into, well, then like the New Testament is just lowering the bar. Like I don't really have to give anything. It's kind of up to me. And in fact, the opposite is true. I think the vision in the New Testament is that people are now giving in response to God's revealed generosity in the person of Jesus, who gave his very life for us. And so in essence, it's kind of two things. You're giving in response to how Jesus has given his life for you out of love for Jesus and under the leadership of the Holy Spirit. So I don't think it's lowering the bar. It's actually upping the bar because now we're giving out of love for Jesus and based on how the Spirit is prompting us to give.
In some ways, it feels like it puts more responsibility on us to actually do the work of taking it to God and praying about it.
Yep.
And wrestling with it.
Yeah, I mean, so in our community, we don't tell people how much they have to give. We just point people to the Holy Spirit. You got to go pray about that. That's all we ask, is that you pray about how God might be leading you to give, and then respond faithfully and then cheerfully. Cameron, what do you think about this? I mean, it's kind of a big paradigm shift to go from like, hey, I have to give this amount, to actually it's something I have to like ask God about and then follow through with.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think that your point about it kind of being not as a way just to lower the bar and be like, hey, cool, I don't have to be as generous as I did before. It's definitely not true. Because, I mean, as we'll talk about here in a minute, that like all that we have belongs to God. And so for some people, maybe it is he asks them to give 10%. For some people, maybe it's less. For some people, maybe it's like 60% or 75% or,
Yeah.
of their time or their money or whatever it might be.
Yeah, and I think there's a posture of openness and trust that's required to genuinely go to God and go, God, how much do you want me to give? Because God knows a person's circumstances better than they even do, and I don't think he's going to lead someone to give away all that they need so that they can't, have food and clothing and that kind of a thing. So there's really a trust that God knows what I need. He wants to provide for me, and he also wants me to step into his kingdom work through a generous life.
Yeah, I was talking to someone maybe a few months ago that felt called to give 90% away and live on 10%. They weren't there yet, but it was a goal that they were working towards, and they were really excited about it. They weren't like anxious or sort of wondering what was going to happen. They were really excited about this vision and eager to get after it. So I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, I think two maybe key chapters in the scripture that supports what we're talking about is in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9. And one of the Apostle Paul's biggest sort of life endeavors was to circle the churches that he had planted throughout the Roman Empire to raise funds to support the church in Jerusalem, who had experienced an incredible famine and was in a place of extreme poverty. And in 2 Corinthians, he's basically letting them know, I'm going to be visiting you, and I don't want you to show up when I come. I don't want you to be empty-handed. I want you to really prioritize generosity to support the church in Jerusalem. And if there were ever a time where Paul wanted to use pressure tactics, guilt or manipulation, or demand a 10% tithe to make sure the church gave, that would have been the time to do it. But instead, he does what we've been talking about. He basically says, don't give reluctantly, but rather follow the Spirit and give cheerfully. And that really frames out, I think, our theology as we encourage people to give, is to simply pray about it and then follow the Spirit's leading and do so faithfully and cheerfully.
So we're not pushing a specific percentage or dollar amount, but rather an all of life thing. So here's another one. Giving is a get to, not a got to. So I think
This is my least favorite one, by the way.
Why is that?
Because it is rhymey and wordplay.
Feels a little corny.
Yeah, so I feel automatic resistance to it.
But not like your shirt.
No,
Cameron, no, not at all. Yes.
Not at all.
Why don't you share the story of your shirt? Because I've been distracted this entire time by how awesome it is.
Well, I had to get some cleaner stuff at Walmart, and I found this teal Kirby shirt, like Nintendo's Kirby, and it just called out to me on a deep level. And so
It's bright teal, like with some
That's true. Some nice
letters or
Yeah,
I don't know what's at the top there.
I think Kirby probably started in Japan. That's where Nintendo started.
Maybe you can wear it next time you preach, and then everyone
Ooh,
will know
there you
what
go.
we're talking about.
That'd be fantastic.
All right, so I'm just going to say it again for
this
Cameron's pleasure.
this is Cameron's least favorite. May it be noted, like mayonnaise, Cameron does not like this one.
Yes.
Giving is a get to, not a got to. I tried to put some intonation in there to make it rhymey for you. But I'm guessing a lot of us see giving financially as something that we should do, right? Like we want to be good people. We feel like we should give to good causes because That's just something that good people do. But what if we saw giving generously as a shift away from guilt or obligation and rather more like a joyful engagement with the work that God is doing in the world? Like as if we actually saw God being up to some amazing things and thought, well, how cool is it that he invites us to participate in them? And we saw it sort of as an opportunity.
Yeah, this, I think, speaks to our attitude and posture when we're giving. And as I was thinking about this, something came to mind. I love giving gifts. Love it. Particularly my wife, Josie. Like when it comes to her birthday or Christmas, like I will start thinking about what would she enjoy? What does she need? What would she like months in advance? And then when I order it and it arrives at our doorstep, like it's so hard not to want to give it to her in advance because I know how much she's going to enjoy it. And then there's so much anticipation and excitement for me when the birthday finally rolls around and I get to see her open up this gift I've like given a lot of thought to, right?
Is gift giving your love language?
It's probably one of them. But I just think like as I was reflecting on all the gifts that I've given Josie over the years and the excitement that produces for me, do I have that same posture of anticipation and excitement when it comes to giving to the things God is doing in the world? And obviously I can't fabricate that, but or force myself into that place. But I just sense a genuine invitation for me to go, well, what would happen if that kind of excitement, that kind of like intentionality existed around using my resources to join the things God's doing in the world, to go, man, I get to be a part of this. Let's see what happens. You know?
Yeah, and I can honestly say that there are times that I felt like that about giving to certain causes, and there are times that I haven't, and I feel like that's okay too. We won't always feel this excitement or joy around getting to give. I don't know that it's a linear progression where we necessarily move in one direction. There may be times that we do and times that we don't. And I think that's okay. There may be circumstances, like maybe I'm going through a difficult season in life. Maybe I feel like the needs of the world are just too great that what can I even do to make an impact? And I think in those moments, God still calls us to generosity. And sometimes it's almost that as we step into it, he transforms our hearts. Does that make sense? So it's kind of like, even if I don't have that excitement that you're talking about, Mac, but I know that I want that, sometimes just stepping out into it and trusting God and allowing him to just work on me in that moment means that that feeling may follow.
Yeah, I think this is opening up maybe a complex conversation around our feelings and how much weight they have in determining our direction or course of action. Because on the one hand, and we'll certainly get into this, I would imagine, in future podcasts around the work of emotional intelligence and being in tune with your emotions. And our emotions communicate things to us, but they also can't be in the driver's seat, And so I'm wanting to validate what you're saying is that sometimes even if we're not feeling excited to step into something, whether it's generosity or something else, but we know it's the next right thing for us to do. Well, when we do it, sometimes the emotions catch up. We have to act our way into new kinds of feelings rather than wait for our feelings to get to a certain place in order to be congruent with actions. Right?
Yeah, it's like we lead with our bodies.
Yes.
Sometimes.
Yes. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So, Cameron, if you were to take a bite of a sandwich with mayo, maybe your feelings would catch up as your body does something different.
No, I don't think
it's
so.
Not going to happen.
It happened accidentally last week. And
it wasn't good.
No, it was a more violent reaction than I was even expecting and would have anticipated. Yeah, and kind of related to this next one, where to give first and live second, is that giving and being generous with whether it is our time or our money or whatever it is the first thing we do, and then we trust that God's going to be there to provide on the back end when, it's giving isn't something we do when we see if we have enough left. but it's like an embodied act that helps me put my money and my talent and all of my resources where my mouth is, that God actually is in charge of all that I have. And it's his to direct how he wants, and that he's going to provide for me no matter what happens.
Yeah, I think this is an invitation and a challenge at the same time, because I imagine for a lot of people, they might be going, okay, I have to look at all the things that I need to spend on, and wants and needs, and then whatever I've left over, I'll kind of give to God. And what you're saying is actually quite different. If we give first and we live second, it's like the first step is step into trust. I have to trust God that you're going to provide. My first step is to give something away as an embodied act of trust in your providence. And then I think the other piece to this that maybe people may not like is if I give some away right up front, I may not have as much to spend on myself later on. And so it immediately joins trust with contentment, which is countercultural. I mean, we're living, as we talked about earlier, you're bombarded with advertisements and messages that you don't have enough, that you need more, and these clever ways to try to get you to act on those feelings and impulses to consume. And I think it's countercultural to live as a community that genuinely trusts God to meet our needs and to practice contentment.
Yeah, it is countercultural. And what's interesting to note about that is that God calls his church to be countercultural, right? Like since the beginning, the church has stood out from the world as showing a different way to live. And in this case, I think we're being called to live in a way that our worth isn't bound up in what we have. It's not bound up in the car we drive, the houses we live in, the clothes we wear, the vacations we take, the stuff we have, but rather our worth is in who we are as people created in the image of God and as people joining his work in the world. And because of that, because we know that as the starting point, we don't have to cling to what we have, anxiously fearing that we won't have enough.
I mean, this is how the early church grew. They grew by caring for the most vulnerable in society. Whether it was the poor, people who were enslaved, unwanted babies, like they really sacrificed and lived. They were a generous community, and it very much contributed to their rapid growth. Now we're living in a culture of consumerism where you never have enough. You should always want more. Our economy is actually built on people buying and consuming more. I think the church today has an incredible opportunity. Similar to the early church, to really embody generosity and care for the least of these in our culture, and not just rely on the government, to do that for us. I'm not against, having policies that care for vulnerable people, but I think that we're not to wait for that. We're to be doing that regardless, looking after the least of these in our culture. One other point on this, I don't know if I'm on a roll or just talking too much, but when we talk about giving first and living second, and that this is a practice of trust, man, for people who have been in a place where they don't know how it's going to work out financially, and then going through that season and seeing God care for them and provide for them more than that, builds your faith muscle quite a bit. When Josie and I got married, we had student loans. We had $1,000 to our name, and I was heading into grad school, and she was the only one working. We had nothing, and we were moving to Chicago, which was super expensive. We had no idea how it was going to work out. And we both grew up in families where financial giving was a priority, like a non-negotiable. And that was part of our DNA, the DNA of our relationship from the very beginning, and we practiced it. We knew, no matter what, when that paycheck comes in, the first thing we're going to do is give some of it away. And we didn't know how it was going to work out, and God provided. And that really set us on a trajectory of simplicity, not living in extravagance that we want to continue to build on. And it solidified this posture of trust that, man, things were so tight financially then, and God took care of us, so we can trust him. All right, so those are, some of our generosity axioms. We have a lot more that we filter through with our community, but it kind of captures how we try to approach generosity in some healthy ways. And if I were just to boil it down to the big paradigm shift, is not to see giving as a percentage, a dollar amount. through guilt and obligation, but rather a love-filled response to the gospel that involves all of life. And man, we're in a season as a church, we've kind of named this at the beginning of the year here, that this is an area we really want to continue to grow in as a church. So, Katie, maybe share some details for listeners in our community here, like what we're up to.
Yeah, so those of you who have come to Crosspoint and have been with us for the past couple of weeks know that we have set a goal for the year of 2023 of 100% participation. So as we've said in this episode, generosity is an all-of-life thing. But in our church right now, we are zooming in on financial generosity and what that would look like to have everyone leaning in. So our goal in this year is to have 100% of people who call Crosspoint home participate financially on a regular basis. And how we're defining regular is at least once a month. So that could mean monthly, biweekly, weekly. But 100% of people who call Crosspoint their home church. And there are a few reasons for this.
And when you say some amount, that's not an amount we're determining. That's something they're supposed to pray about.
Right. Any amount, the amount that they pray about and feel that God is leading them to give. So obviously all the reasons we just spent, all this time unpacking, we believe that everyone who wants to grow as a disciple of Christ is called to grow in the area of generosity. And so if we want to be a church who's about making disciples, we need to grow in generosity.
Yeah.
That's sort of the big obvious one. But two logistical reasons for this goal. The first is that we want to broaden participation in our church to become a healthier church. So we've talked in past episodes about kind of the 80-20 rule, where maybe 20% of people get really excited about a vision and do the vast majority of the work to get there, while maybe 20% tend to take maybe a more consumer or passive approach. And
I think it's flipped. 80% are more consumer and 20%.
Yeah, did I reverse that? Mm-hmm. Yes, 20% is doing 80% of the work.
Thank you, Cameron.
And the 80% tends to take a more passive role. We just see that as sort of a common pattern in churches.
And it creates an unhealthy environment. Healthier churches, as we named in the previous episode, is where everybody's leaning in and participating, not just a few.
Exactly, yeah. And we know at the same time, it's important to say we know that everyone is in a different position in terms of what they can give, right? And that's why we're not saying a dollar amount. But it is critical to the health of our church to have everyone contributing something, to have everyone leaning in financially, bought into the mission of the church and leaning in together in what God is doing here. So we want to broaden participation just to be a healthier church. And then we also want to be in a position to steward our resources well. And so...
you mean steward. I said that last episode by accident.
You did.
Self-deprecation.
Stuart is not on staff or part of our financial challenge, but we can talk about him. We talked from the stage about how in 2021, as an example, we had 39% of giving throughout the entire year come in special giving, primarily at the end of the year. So just think about that. If you had 39% of your income come in at one time of the year, but yet you had to set a budget that speaks to the whole year and to make decisions on what to spend on the building and utilities and decisions that have to be somewhat stable throughout the year, that creates a challenge because you have unpredictability in terms of what'll be coming in, but you have a responsibility to create a budget to determine what will be going out. And so this challenge is to help us be better stewards and to make good decisions based on consistent giving so that we know what to expect and so that we can prioritize our ministry goals throughout the year. And so to help us get started towards this goal, we've had a generous donor step forward and put together what we're calling a challenge grant to inspire us to give. And what that looks like is we've got, for every individual who steps forward and becomes a new monthly giver, so people who aren't giving monthly but decide to, we have $25 going to a family in need through our school district. So for couples who step forward, that's $50. And this is the idea that giving, by stepping forward and giving, you end up paying it forward. Your generosity unleashes further generosity into families in need in our community.
How cool is that? So, fleshing this out, what this means for people. If someone's listening to this and they're already giving monthly, that's awesome. You're sort of embodying the type of participation we're inviting people to step into. if maybe someone's listening and they give occasionally, but it's not monthly, this is a chance to like increase that frequency to help our practices throughout the year, and it unleashes that generosity to families in need. I think if someone isn't giving at all, right, this is a real challenge, and we've given you a lot of reasons in this podcast episode to step into that. And I imagine there's some people who might be listening to this podcast that aren't part of our community. And there's no pressure, obviously, but they might feel led to give monthly. We had a visitor a few weeks ago who's just so excited about the way we were talking about generosity and the fact that it would go to a family in need. This individual is just visiting one time and is now giving monthly. So no pressure, but maybe there's someone who is listening who's going, yeah, I believe in this podcast. I believe in the work God's doing at Crosspoint, and I'd like to become a monthly giver. And there's definitely an invitation for people to pray about that.
Yes, we've talked about a lot of stuff. I think that one of the things that feels most significant if you're listening at home or in the car or whatever it is you listen to podcasts, is that generosity is more than just like an idea to think about, but it actually requires some embodied action, like to do something with it. So I would just encourage you, one thing that we've talked about before with our church and that I know I do from time to time is to do like a generosity audit, kind of look at my life and see what are all the resources God has blessed me with right now. Some of those are financial, but also all the other things we talked about, like time and treasure and talents, all that stuff. And just be open-handed with God and pray and ask and discern and ask God, what am I holding on to too tightly for myself? What are you inviting me to give away in this season? And then, creating some sort of plan for what that looks like, because it's great to have a quiet time with God and be like, wow, yeah, I should be more generous and sacrificial. But if you don't plan out what that looks like, it's probably not going to happen. So just to step into that, wherever it is God has you, I think that was one of the key takeaways for me, is that generosity is something we discern with God, not just some rule that's imposed upon us. So I just encourage you to spend some time doing that.
Yeah, thanks for joining us today. We hope that you enjoyed today's episode. I want to throw an invitation out there. If there's questions, comments, or maybe even future topics that you're curious about, you want us to discuss, please email us. We would love to hear from you. Next time, we're going to press into our next core value as a church, which is team leadership. So here at Crosspoint, we embrace a team model of leadership where authority is diffused among a team of mature Jesus followers who submit to one another and to the leadership of the Holy Spirit. So we hope you'll tune in, and we'll see you next time.
Praxis is recorded and produced at Crosspoint Community Church. You can find out more about the show and our church at crosspointwi.com. If you have any questions, comments, or have any suggestions for future topics, feel free to send us an email. Also, if you enjoy the show, consider leaving a review. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.